All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring one of the most turbulent, absolutely transformative decades in American history. We're going to track how the soaring political optimism of the early 1960s completely fractured by the decade's end. It's a political whiplash that, honestly, still shapes the country today. Think about it. How does a country swing from a massive liberal landslide in 1964 to a crushing conservative landslide just 8 years later? What internal and external forces shattered that mid-century liberal consensus and triggered such a rapid, dramatic political realignment? That is exactly what we're looking at today. So here's our roadmap. We'll start with liberalism's high watermark, then move into the Vietnam quagmire, hit the boiling point of 1968 when the nation divided, look at the new voices for liberation, and finally explore how the silent majority speaks. Let's get into it. Part 1. Liberalism's high water mark. Take a look at the 1964 election. The map is just a sea of blue. Lyndon B. Johnson secured this crushing landslide victory over Republican Barry Goldwater. And this massive mandate from the public, it effectively gave LBJ a blank check to push forward an incredibly ambitious domestic reform agenda. And the stats from this era are staggering. Between 1959 and 1973, the proportion of Americans living below the poverty line literally dropped by half, falling from 23% down to just 11%. That 12% drop represents millions of real people lifted out of destitution. So how did they pull that off? Through a breathtaking legislative blitz we know as the Great Society. We're talking about the foundational blocks of the modern American welfare state, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, there's a big debate here. Liberals credited these massive government programs for the success, while conservatives at the time argued that a booming, high-performing economy actually deserved the credit for reducing poverty. They warned that this unprecedented government spending was laying some dangerous groundwork for the future. But just as domestic reforms peaked, things started to shift. Part 2. The Vietnam quagmire. The escalation overseas was shockingly fast. Following reports of an attack on U.S. ships, LBJ secured the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in '64, which was effectively a congressional green light to conduct operations however he saw fit. By 1965, the first combat Marines were landing at Da Nang, and by 1968, America had 500,000 troops stationed halfway across the world. The sheer scale of this just spiraled completely out of control. We go from a relatively small footprint of 23,000 personnel in the early 60s, rocketing up to an astonishing peak of over 543,000 by 1968. That pulled hundreds of thousands of young American men straight into the jungle. But, numbers only tell half the story. The draft was deeply, deeply personal. Take Donald Whitfield, a working-class draftee from Alabama. He was just pumping gas, tinkering with cars to support his poor family, and suddenly, he's pulled into a geopolitical conflict thousands of miles away. You can really feel the interruption of everyday life. And overseas, the reality was just devastating. Gail Smith, a surgical nurse in Vietnam, described seeing young men torn up day after day. Her words really highlight the severe psychological toll and dehumanization the conflict inflicted. The trauma wasn't just physical, right? It was deeply moral and psychological, bleeding into the consciousness of absolutely everyone involved. Which brings us to the boiling point. Part 3, 1968, A Nation Divided. Back home, frustration is mounting fast. You've got the free speech movement at Berkeley representing this deeply organized, passionate student resistance. At the same time, visceral imagery, like a battered Uncle Sam poster, shows how student movements and the broader counterculture were merging. It became a highly vocal resistance against the government, the draft, and the establishment as a whole. And then 1968 hits. This is maybe the most shocking, volatile year in post-war American history. The Tet Offensive proves the war is far from over, completely shattering public confidence. Then you have the tragic assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. Grief literally explodes into riots across over 100 cities. And it all culminates in these chaotic, violent clashes between police and anti-war protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. There was this palpable, terrifying sense of despair, a feeling that the country was literally coming apart at the seams. And the political fallout? Immediate. that dominant Democratic coalition from just 4 years ago, completely fractures, which allows Republican Richard Nixon to eke out a victory. But look at the Deep South. George Wallace, running as a third-party candidate, tapped into severe racial backlash and anxiety over urban riots to sweep the region. The political map was being rewritten in real time. Even as the political center shifted right, the left was transforming. Part 4. New Voices for Liberation. All of this unrest actually birthed entirely new movements. We see the rise of modern feminism, symbolized by MS Magazine, demanding not just equality, but a total rethinking of societal roles. Simultaneously, the post-Stonewall gay liberation movement emerges in Greenwich Village, demanding visibility and basic human rights. It's super important to distinguish between the early 60s and the late 60s here. The earlier rights liberalism focused on the New Deal coalition and legal integration, passing bills, changing laws within the system. But these new liberation movements, they were different. They focused heavily on identity, anti-imperialism, and radical systemic change. They rejected those older liberal compromises. And while these movements were groundbreaking, they also created rifts, often alienating more moderate, blue-collar voters who felt things were just changing way too fast. And that brings us to our final chapter, Part 5, The Silent Majority Speaks. Richard Nixon brilliantly leveraged this exact feeling. He coined the term the silent majority, speaking directly to moderate, ordinary Americans who felt totally overshadowed by the loud, radical protests of the era. These were voters who weren't out marching. They were exhausted by years of urban riots, endless anti-war demonstrations, and incredibly rapid social shifts. Nixon promised them a return to law, order, and traditional values. And this resistance, it wasn't just a Southern thing. Up in Boston, working-class whites actively and sometimes violently revolted against court-ordered desegregation programs like busing. It really showed that frustration with government intervention had crossed regional lines, further fueling a nationwide conservative turn. So by 1972, the pendulum swing is complete. Richard Nixon wins a crushing 60% of the popular vote. He paints almost the entire electoral map red, handing the Democrats one of the most devastating defeats in American history. When you put the numbers side by side, the sheer scale of this reversal is just staggering. In '64, LBJ won 486 electoral votes to 52. 8 years later, Nixon flips it entirely, winning 520 to 17. I mean, to see a nation's political identity invert that completely and that quickly is incredibly rare. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative question to consider. Did the liberal agenda of the Great Society simply push too far, too fast for the American public? Or did the tragic, overlapping chaos of an unwinnable war in Vietnam and devastating domestic assassinations just exhaust the nation's appetite for change? It's a profound debate about how quickly a society's political consensus can unravel, and it's a history that definitely still echoes in our political divides today. Thanks for exploring this with me.